Last weekend I released a video about 70s inspired sports watches. I mentioned that I had considered calling that video Genta inspired watches, and I realised at that moment that actually, while I've heard the name and know the pieces he designed, actually that's where my knowledge stops. Given that he is responsible for some of the most iconic and enduring watch designs, I wanted to try and rectify that ignorance, and figured that I might as well make one of my retrospective documentary style pieces on Genta while I was at it. If his work is of interest to you, this will be a look into his personal history, design inspirations, and some of the famous models that he is responsible for. With all that said, let's get into the video. Let's begin at the beginning. Genta was born to parents of northern Italian descent in the modern home of watchmaking, Geneva, on the 1st of May 1931. As a child, he had a flair for art and spent a good portion of his free time painting and honing his artistic craft. His long-term goal was to become a fashion designer, but his family were not well off. He had to work from a young age to help them get by. In his youth, he trained in both jewellery making and goldsmithing, earning his Swiss Federal Diploma at the age of 20. After this, he got his first break into the watchmaking industry, being taken on by Universal Genève, who were at the time one of the most celebrated producers of chronographs in the world. They haven't produced a watch in nearly 40 years at the time of scripting this video, but they are now owned by Breitling, who are in the process of trying to revive them. There's a really slick website at the moment, which is interesting to explore, but no real hints as to what they are making. Anyway, his first major project saw him working with the newly patented micro rotors within the brand as part of the technical team. However, Genta was something of a savant, auteur, artist even. I'm not sure what the horological parlance would be, but think the Hideo Kojima, the Quentin Tarantino, the Vincent van Gogh of watchmaking, and you won't be far off. His early work on the micro rotors led to the release of the automatic pole router in 1954, Genta's first original design. This was particularly impressive given Genta's age at only 23. Alongside the demanding specifications required of the piece, which had to meet the requirements for use by the SAS. To all intents and purposes, it's an attractive watch, but doesn't have any of the styling cues you might have come to expect from Genta. There are a few things going on there. First of all, it's from his formative years, where he would have been more prone to taking inspirations from others already in the space, and secondly, as the name Genta has become more and more famous, it is beneficial now for companies to link every watch they can to his name as it increases their desirability. The pole router is essentially one of the most affordable Genta watches that you can buy though, starting just above $1,000 for a piece in decent condition. It is also true that the success of the model led to Universal Genève releasing a lot of them, despite Genta effectively becoming a freelance designer shortly after, at the beck and call of a number of high-profile brands. The most notable among his earlier works from the 50s were the Goldene Ellipse for Patek Philippe, followed by the Omega Constellation in 1959, which I should add is up there with the pole router in terms of an affordable Genta piece for a collection. He carried on throughout the 60s, producing a number of watches, including another one for Universal Genève, the Golden Shadow, in 1965. By the end of the decade, however, he was so well known, respected and in demand from the industry that he was able to set up his own watchmaking company bearing his own name. You can have a more detailed look at the company at geraldgenta.com if that is something that interests you, but it won't be the focus here, as his most successful and famous works continue to be born out of the work he continued to do with other brands. Before we get into that though, it's worth acknowledging the background to Genta's work in the 1970s. The Swiss watchmaking industry was under serious threat. In 1969, Seiko had released the Astron, the world's first quartz watch. This was already a serious concern, as the technology was significantly more accurate at time telling than mechanical or automatic movements could ever hope to be. However, the Astron itself was a pretty expensive timepiece, as were a number of the early Quartz releases shortly after it. The problem really kicked in when the ability to mass produce quartz movements at extremely low prices came into full effect later in the decade. The Swiss watchmaking industry simply could not compete on price, accuracy, or volume. If you hear people talking about the quartz crisis, this is what they are referring to, and a number of established horological brands closed their doors during this time as a result. Of the famous ones that survived, many can point to a Genta designed piece that saved them from the brink. You could take that a step further and credit him with the survival of automatic and mechanical watchmaking as a whole. That might be a reach, but there is definitely a case to be made there. That is why he is viewed by so many as the saviour of traditional watchmaking. The first, and indeed most famous, of the watches that Genta developed during this time was the Royal Oak for Audemars Piguet. This was such a departure from watchmaking at the time, which had up until that point been a mixture of gentrified refinement in terms of dress pieces, or pushing the boundaries in terms of dive capabilities and chronograph accuracy. Something as bold, fashion-focused and eye-catching as the Royal Oak made waves in the market. Initially, consumers didn't know quite what to make of it, but very quickly it became one of the most in-demand pieces on the market. What really speaks to the genius of Genta is the story behind its development. On the eve of the 1971 Basel World Fair, literally the day before, Georges Goulet, managing director of AP, called Genta at 4 in the afternoon, stating in no uncertain terms that the brand's future was potentially in dire straits and it needed a Hail Mary to save it, and it needed it the following day. Genta set to work overnight, and by the following morning the Royal Oak had been born, in sketch form at least. The design was based on the aesthetic of a traditional diver's helmet, functional, rugged, built to last, and providing a lot of different surfaces for AP to show off their finishing techniques. They could also show off further with the finishing on the dial, with the trademark waffle pattern that the watch is now so synonymous with. At 39mm in diameter, it was a larger, bolder piece for the time, even if 39mm would be considered by some as positively conservative by modern standards. The key dimension was the thickness though. Only 7mm thick, the quality and size of the 2121 caliber could really be shown off to full effect. By 1972, the watch was ready for release at the following Basel World Fair. The initial run was priced at 3,300 Swiss francs. Exchanged to dollars and adjusted for inflation, that comes out to around $28,000 in today's money. At the time, precious metal models from other prestigious brands sold for considerably less. The Royal Oak was therefore a statement to the public and to the horological industry that quality mattered. Initially, as I've said, the market was skeptical, but slowly and surely demand began to grow. In the modern day, if you slap a Supreme logo on literally anything, it at least doubles in value. What was clear with the Royal Oak though is that this wasn't just a sea change in design and branding, it was a serious step up in overall quality too, and a change in direction for Swiss watchmaking in general. They couldn't hope to compete with Japanese manufacturers when it came to producing cheap quartz pieces, and continuing to do what they were doing and expecting things to be fine clearly wasn't going to work either. Instead, they needed pieces like the Royal Oak to change the perception of the general public. Mechanical and automatic watches were now items of prestige, of supreme craftsmanship. Sure, you can go and buy a coffee from a machine in McDonald's, but an artisanally made coffee from a professional barista, despite being way more expensive, is also going to be far better. I also think time itself is a factor here. The idea being that if you value your watch and if your watch has value, it implies that you also value your time. Owning a Royal Oak became a serious status symbol, and it still is today. I would just add though that I don't include the offshore range in that sentiment. I think they are an affront to Genta's masterpiece. It was with the success of the Royal Oak that Genta's name became ever more in demand and respected. He was already up there with a number of hits under his belt and indeed his own brand, but the Royal Oak took him to another level. It was no surprise then that Patek Philippe, seeing that AP were making a killing without using precious metals to do so, wanted a piece of the action and of course approached Genta to get involved. While at a restaurant, once again during the Basel World Fair, Genta sketched out the Nautilus using paper and pencil in less than 5 minutes. This time his inspiration was the portholes you might have found on cruise ships of the day. I have to admire these flashes of creative brilliance that Genta had throughout his career. I challenge you to visit the AP or Patek websites at any point over the next few decades and not see a Nautilus or Royal Oak featured somewhere on the homepage. They simply wouldn't be the powerhouses of watchmaking that they are today without Genta. On a personal note, he actually designed another sports watch for IWC in 1976, the Ingenieur, which would actually be my favourite over the Royal Oak and the Nautilus. I just think they should have named it something cooler and they might have had a much bigger hit on their hands. It really is gorgeous. Genta was fairly prolific as a designer, and while I've detailed his biggest hits, I do think it is worth mentioning the Bulgari Octo and the Cradle Locomotive as other highlights to simply feast your eyes on. Not everything was at that level though. The King Midas Cellini for Rolex, for example, is a pretty niche piece for what I would describe as very selective tastes. Ironically, my favourite sports watch from the 1970s, the Vacheron 222, is often erroneously credited to Genta as he became so synonymous with the style, but was actually designed by Jörg Heisek. I've had fun looking into the history of Genta and educating myself further. It is pretty depressing that I'll likely never even get to handle most of these pieces, let alone own one. While prices are coming down pretty sharply following the COVID bubble, they are still well out of my reach. Even without owning one though, with my favourite style of watches being 70s inspired sports pieces, every single one of them has Genta inspiration somewhere in their design. Still, I hope you've enjoyed, and if there are any other designers you want me to make a retrospective about, let me know in the comments section below. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it informative, consider dropping the video a like and subscribing for more content like this in future.